Less than 24 hours. That is all it took. The ink on the verdict was barely dry. The courtroom in McKinney, Texas had barely emptied. The Metcalf family was still processing what a jury of 12 had just decided after less than 3 hours of deliberation. And yet, by the very next morning, June 10, 2026, a single document had already been filed with the court, a notice of appeal, submitted by the defense team of Karmelo Anthony, less than 1 full day after he was sentenced to 35 years in a Texas prison. And that decision, that move, made in the dark hours after one of the most racially polarizing verdicts in recent Texas history, may have just set in motion a legal process that could take years to resolve, possibly longer. This is True Crime Vault, where we don't just cover the verdict, we follow the case wherever it leads next. Before we go any deeper into this, make sure you subscribe to True Crime Vault and hit that notification bell. We cover the cases that don't stop being important just because the cameras move on. Every single week, we go back in and keep pulling threads. If you believe in that kind of journalism, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to see these stories. Now, let's talk about what is actually happening here. Because most of what you've seen in the last 48 hours has been reaction, emotion, opinion. What this channel is going to do is something different. We are going to look at the law. We are going to look at the record. We are going to look at the specific legal arguments that Karmelo Anthony's defense team is almost certainly building right now. And we are going to ask the only question that matters going forward. Can it work? Because here is the thing about an appeal in a case like this. It is not a do-over. It is not a moment for new witnesses or new evidence or a different jury. It is an argument, a specific, documented legal argument that something went wrong at trial, that a judge made a ruling that violated the law, that the process itself was flawed in a way that affected the outcome. And in this case, there is at least one argument that legal observers have been talking about since before the trial even started, an argument that was raised inside the courtroom, preserved on the official record, and denied by the judge on the spot. An argument that is now going to the 5th District Court of Appeals in downtown Dallas. To understand why this matters so much, you have to go back to the very beginning of this story, not the stabbing. Not April 2nd of 2025, the day Austin Metcalf lost his life at David Kuykendall Stadium in Frisco, Texas. You have to understand the world this case was born into, because context is everything when you are trying to make sense of why this particular trial generated the kind of national attention it did. Frisco, Texas, is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. In the span of 2 decades, it transformed from a small suburban town into a sprawling, affluent community north of Dallas with one of the highest rated school districts in the state. But growth brought tension, demographic shifts that not everyone in the community was prepared to navigate. Frisco was already dealing with conversations about race, about belonging, about who felt safe and who did not, long before April 2nd, 2025, put the city on every news broadcast in the country. When 2 students from rival high schools, one black, one white, ended up in a fatal confrontation at a school-sponsored track event, it did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a community that was already struggling, and the moment those details hit social media, the case was immediately absorbed into the broader national argument about race in America, about self-defense law, about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who does not. Both sides of that argument attached themselves to this case with real ferocity. White nationalist groups were posting about Austin Metcalf within days of his death. Far-right activists and online communities were amplifying the case as a symbol of something larger than what happened under one tent on one rainy morning. On April 19, 2025, a group called Protect White Americans held a formal protest at David Kuykendall Stadium, the very stadium where Metcalf died. Protesters demanded that Anthony be returned to custody. 2 counter-protesters were arrested. Austin Metcalf's own father attended that demonstration, not to support it, but to condemn it. He told the organizer of the protest directly and publicly that he disapproved, that the effort was creating racial division rather than bridging it, and that he did not condone anything the group was doing. He asked them to take his son's school portrait off their website. That says something profound about how complicated this case actually is beneath the surface of the shouting. On the other side of the cultural argument, advocacy organizations quickly rallied around Karmelo Anthony. The Next Generation Action Network, known as NGAN, became the most prominent voice in his corner, holding press conferences, managing public communications for the family, and eventually pledging $10,000 toward his appeal following the verdict. NGAN founder and president Dominique Alexander made public statements about racial disparities in the legal process, about the absence of black jurors in the final panel, about what he described as systemic inequities in how the case was handled. Both families were caught in the middle of forces much larger than any of them asked to be part of. Austin Metcalf's father had his home swatted. A SWAT team showed up at his house with weapons drawn. Karmelo Anthony's family faced death threats serious enough that the court approved moving them to an undisclosed location. Both fathers were ultimately forced to leave their jobs because of online harassment and doxing. A judge who made a routine bond decision had her home address published online and received threats serious enough to involve the FBI. Nobody in this story was left untouched by the machinery of the internet's anger. And yet the trial itself, when it finally arrived in June of 2026, was supposed to be about one thing. Not race, not social media, not protest groups or hashtags or fundraising pages on GiveSendGo or GoFundMe. The trial was supposed to be about what happened between two 17-year-olds on the morning of April 2, 2025, and whether the law calls it murder or something else. Jury selection in the Karmelo Anthony trial began on June 1, 2026, with Judge John Roach Jr. presiding. Nearly 600 people were summoned to be considered as potential jurors. 600. The county knew this was going to be watched. The process, called voir dire, a French legal term meaning roughly to speak the truth, is the phase where both prosecution and defense question prospective jurors, probe for bias, and make decisions about who they want deciding this case. Each side has a limited number of what are called peremptory strikes. These are free passes. A certain number of jurors either side can remove without having to provide a reason. Standard procedure, built into the system. But there is a rule. A firm constitutional rule that comes directly from the United States Supreme Court, established in 1986 in a case called Batson versus Kentucky. The ruling could not have been clearer. You cannot use peremptory strikes to remove a juror because of their race. It violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Full stop. Here is what happened in Collin County, Texas, in the first week of June 2026. The prosecution used 3 of their final peremptory strikes on the last 3 black prospective jurors remaining in the pool. All 3 gone, every single one. The jury that was ultimately seated, 12 jurors and 6 alternates, did not include a single black juror, not one. In a case that the entire country understood to have a racial dimension, in a county already marked by racial tension, in a trial being watched by millions of people, the jury box contained no black voices at all. Michael Howard, Karmelo Anthony's defense attorney, raised the alarm immediately. He filed a formal Batson challenge in open court, right there in front of Judge John Roach Jr. His argument was direct. 100% of the available African-American prospective jurors in the strike zone had been removed through those 3 strikes. He argued plainly that the systematic removal of those jurors was racially motivated. The prosecution pushed back hard. Their explanation: the 3 black women who were struck all worked as educators. In a case built around a high school track event, a school-sponsored competition, a confrontation between students from competing school programs, educators, they argued, might bring particular sympathy toward young people in school settings, might view the defendant through the lens of a professional who works with teenagers every day. It was a race-neutral reason. Profession, not race. Judge Roach accepted the explanation. He denied the Batson challenge. The jury was seated. That ruling, one decision by one judge on one morning, is now the centerpiece of what may be a multi-year appellate fight. To understand why, you have to understand how the Batson analysis changes when a case moves from the trial level to an appellate court. At trial, the bar for defeating a Batson challenge is genuinely low. A prosecutor does not need to prove anything. They need only offer an explanation that is facially race-neutral, something that sounds plausible. Judges almost always defer to that kind of explanation in the moment. The system at the trial level makes Batson challenges very hard to win, but appellate courts operate differently. When they review a Batson claim, they do not just ask whether the prosecutor gave a race-neutral reason. They ask whether that reason survives actual scrutiny. They look at the complete voir dire record. They compare prospective jurors of different races. They ask whether white jurors who shared the same characteristics as the struck black jurors were kept on the panel. And most importantly, were there white educators in that jury pool who were not struck? SMU law professor Anna Offit, who was observing the trial, put this plainly to Fox 4 Dallas. The appellate courts, she explained, look at whether similarly situated jurors of different races were asked the same questions, the same number of follow-up questions, and whether similarly situated white jurors were kept while similarly situated black jurors were removed. That comparison has not been made yet. It is about to be made, line by line, in the 5th District Court of Appeals in downtown Dallas. Because here is the thing about a voir dire record. It captures everything. Every question, every answer, every follow-up, every juror who was seated, every juror who was struck, and exactly what each of them said. If there is a white teacher or school administrator in that transcript who was seated on that jury, someone who shared the professional background that the prosecution used to justify striking the black prospective jurors, that inconsistency is now documented. It is preserved. And a defense attorney who knows what they are looking for is going to find it. The Davis Vanguard, a legal news publication that covers criminal justice issues nationally, put the analysis simply. What ultimately matters is not whether prosecutors offered a race-neutral explanation at trial. What matters is whether that explanation survives scrutiny on appeal. That scrutiny is coming, and it has worked before. Specifically in Texas, the black man case involved a conviction for drug offenses, sentenced to 30 years. On appeal, the defendant argued that the prosecution had used a peremptory strike to remove a black juror in violation of Batson. The Court of Appeals reviewed the record, determined that the race-neutral explanation offered at trial was a pretext, and reversed the conviction entirely. Not reduced, reversed. The Miller versus Cockrell case was even more significant. Thomas Miller sat on Texas death row after being convicted by an all-white jury. His legal team spent years working through the appellate system, arguing that black prospective jurors had been unconstitutionally removed during voir dire. Eventually, the case reached the United States Supreme Court, which reviewed the full trial record, every juror questionnaire, every strike, every voir dire exchange, and ruled that the removal of those jurors had violated Batson. The conviction was overturned. The Foster versus Chapman case out of Georgia showed how far a Batson argument can travel. The prosecution struck all 4 black prospective jurors and offered race-neutral explanations. The trial court accepted them. Direct appeal courts accepted them. Foster was convicted and remained in prison for years, but his legal team later obtained the prosecution's internal jury selection notes through separate legal proceedings. Those private notes showed the prosecutors had explicitly ranked African American jurors against each other and highlighted their race as a factor. Written evidence of racial intent that had never appeared in court. The United States Supreme Court reversed the conviction. Now, the Anthony case almost certainly does not have private notes floating around somewhere documenting improper intent. That level of documentary evidence is rare, but that is not what the defense needs. They need the voir dire transcript. They need to find one white educator, one person with a comparable professional background to the 3 black women who were struck, who was allowed to sit on that jury. One data point, one inconsistency. That is the thread they are pulling right now. There is also the question of video. During the trial, prosecutors presented security camera footage from Kuykendall Stadium. Their argument was that the footage showed the sequence of events: Anthony entering the Memorial High School tent, a series of movements consistent with the confrontation described by eyewitnesses, and then Anthony leaving and running. They used it to support their theory that this was not self-defense but an escalating situation that Anthony had helped create. The defense argued a fundamentally different version of events. Their account, supported by at least one student witness and by Coach Adam Linwood from Centennial High School, who testified that it was not unusual for athletes from different schools to share tent space, was that Anthony was already seated in the tent when he was approached, that multiple people confronted him, asked him to leave, and that the physical contact, whatever form it took, came from Austin Metcalf's side first. The defense positioned Anthony as a teenager who was outnumbered, outweighed by 50 to 60 pounds at minimum, and who acted in a moment of genuine fear. Multiple student witnesses for the prosecution labeled Anthony as the aggressor. They described him entering the tent from outside, refusing to leave when asked, an estimated 15 times, and keeping his hands in his backpack while warning that he had something in there. One witness described the exchange lasting approximately 2 minutes before the stabbing occurred. The defense's cross-examination focused on inconsistencies between these students' trial testimony and the accounts they originally gave to law enforcement. The security footage became the backdrop against which both narratives played out, and neither side agreed on what it showed. Supporters of Karmelo Anthony, including attorney Christopher King, who spoke publicly outside the courthouse on the evening of June 9th, stated directly that the video evidence they viewed did not match the narrative presented at trial. They raised questions about whether the footage was clear enough to establish the precise sequence of who moved first, and whether the jury was shown the full picture of what it recorded. Appellate courts are generally reluctant to second-guess how juries interpreted evidence. That is the fundamental function of a jury. But if the defense can argue that evidence was admitted in a legally flawed way, or that the jury instructions around self-defense were incorrect, a separate basis for reversal exists. It is a narrower argument than the Batson claim, but it is not a frivolous one. And then there is the comparison that no one officially raises, but that the numbers make unavoidable. 2 years before this trial, in Belton, Texas, a student named Case Allison was involved in a confrontation at his school. He had a knife. Another student, Jose Luis Ramirez Jr., threw the first punch, documented clearly on video. Allison stabbed Ramirez. Ramirez died. Allison went to trial. The jury found him not guilty of murder, convicted instead on a charge of criminally negligent homicide. The maximum sentence he could receive, 2 years. 2 years versus 35. Same state, same claim of self-defense, same outcome for the person on the receiving end of that knife. The physical circumstances, a larger, heavier person initiating contact with a smaller person who was carrying a knife, were arguably more documented in favor of self-defense in the Allison case than in the Anthony case. But the outcomes were staggeringly different. Case Allison testified in his own defense. He told the jury directly, in his own voice, that he was frightened, that he had warned Ramirez, that the physical contact came first from the other person. Karmelo Anthony did not testify. That is a significant difference, and it likely affected the jury's evaluation of his state of mind in the moment. The video in the Allison case was clearer. The first punch was unambiguous. The physical dynamic was documented. The video in the Anthony case was described as grainy and disputed. And then there is everything else. Case Allison is white. Jose Ramirez was Latino. Karmelo Anthony is black. Austin Metcalf was white. No one in any official capacity is going to say those demographic facts explain the difference between 2 years and 35 years. And perhaps they don't. Perhaps the differences in testimony, in video clarity, in how the respective defense teams presented their cases, fully account for the divergence. Perhaps there are details in both trials that make them less comparable than the surface-level facts suggest, but the comparison exists. It will be raised during the appeal, and in a case where racial composition of the jury is already a documented legal issue, the Allison parallel is not going to quietly disappear. Community advocate Bruce Carter told NBC DFW after the verdict that he had expected a manslaughter conviction and a sentence somewhere between 10 and 15 years, not 35. And he said something in that interview that is worth sitting with. He said there were no winners here. He was right in the most straightforward sense possible. There is no version of this story where everyone is okay. The prosecution is confident. Collin County District Attorney Greg Willis said justice was served. His team presented nearly 24 witnesses. They built a case on eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and video footage. Collin County Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Elizabeth Ventura testified about the nature of the injury Austin Metcalf sustained, a wound to the chest that reached his heart. The jury heard all of it and reached a unanimous verdict of murder in under 3 hours. They also had the option to convict on lesser charges. The judge had allowed them to consider manslaughter, which would have carried a maximum sentence of 20 years. They chose not to. They went to murder. And they sentenced him to 35 years, which was within the range the law permitted for a defendant his age, given that Texas does not allow life without parole for crimes committed as a minor. Both sides in the courtroom told the jury this case was not about race. Both the prosecution and the defense explicitly asked the jury to decide based only on the evidence in front of them, and legally, that is exactly what juries are supposed to do. But the jury selection process, the part that happened before those 12 people ever heard a single piece of evidence, is now under a legal microscope. Let us now be very clear about what happens from here in practical terms. Michael Howard has filed the notice of appeal. That is step 1. It is a short document. It simply puts the court on notice that the defense intends to challenge the conviction at the appellate level. Step 2 is the construction of a full written brief. This document will lay out every legal argument the defense believes should result in a reversal. It will reference specific rulings by Judge Roach during the trial. It will reference the voir dire record in detail. It will make the Batson argument with documentation. It will address the self-defense instructions if the defense believes they were flawed. It will be a comprehensive legal argument. The prosecution then files a response brief arguing why the conviction should stand. The 5th District Court of Appeals reviews both documents. Oral arguments may or may not be scheduled, and then the appellate judges deliberate and issue a ruling. Timeline: months at minimum, likely more than a year. Possibly significantly longer if the case escalates through the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals or into the federal system. The most significant Batson case in Texas history took over a decade to fully resolve. That is not a prediction about this case. It is a reminder that the American appellate system moves at its own pace and answers to no one's timeline. Karmelo Anthony will spend those months and years inside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He was 19 years old when he entered that system. He has a notice of appeal and a defense team that believes there are real issues worth fighting for. He has a mother who stood in open court and asked for mercy. He has a community of supporters who have pledged resources to his legal fight. He also has 35 years hanging over his head while the process plays out. And Jeff Metcalf, Austin's father, will wake up every single morning without his son. Hunter Metcalf will carry his twin's absence for the rest of his life. There is no appellate ruling that addresses any of that. There is no legal outcome that changes what was lost on April 2, 2025. That is the part of this story that tends to get swallowed by the procedural details. The legal analysis matters. The constitutional questions matter. The integrity of the jury selection process matters for reasons that extend far beyond this individual case. Because if peremptory strikes can be used to systematically remove black jurors from a racially sensitive trial, that is not a local problem. That is a problem with the American legal system itself, and it deserves serious examination. But inside all of that examination, there are 2 families, real people, real loss, real grief that does not follow any appellate briefing schedule. Austin Metcalf was 17 years old. He had a twin brother. He played linebacker and ran track. He worked at a pizza place in Frisco and had a 4.0 grade point average. He woke up on a Wednesday in April to go compete at a school event and never came home. He is not a hashtag. He was not a symbol of anything. He was a kid. A real kid with a real life and a real future that ended under a tent in a rainstorm. Karmelo Anthony was 17 years old. He was a team captain. He had a 3.7 grade point average. He had 2 part-time jobs. He was on track to graduate. He had plans. In 30 seconds, all of that was replaced by a murder charge and now by a prison sentence and a notice of appeal that his lawyers filed before the sun came up on June 10, 2026. 2 people, 1 rainy morning, and consequences still unfolding. The appeal is real. The legal grounds are real. Whether they are sufficient is a question that judges in Dallas are going to spend the next year or more answering. And True Crime Vault is going to be here every step of the way, covering every ruling, following every development, asking the questions that most outlets stop asking the moment the next story breaks. If this case matters to you, and I believe it should, regardless of which side of the verdict you sit on, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear from you. I want to know whether you believe the Batson challenge was a legitimate constitutional violation or a procedural technicality. I want to know whether you think the jury reached the right verdict on the evidence. I want to know whether the Casey-Allison comparison changes how you see this outcome. Because these conversations are worth having. Not because they bring Austin Metcalf back. Not because they undo what happened to Karmelo Anthony or his family. But because the questions raised by this case, about race and juries and self-defense and what equal protection actually means in practice, are questions that matter for every person who might one day sit in a courtroom as a defendant or as a juror or as a victim's family watching from the gallery. These are not just stories. These are real people, real lives, real mysteries of justice that deserve to be taken seriously, followed carefully, and remembered. True Crime Vault. We will see you in the next investigation. There is a layer of this story that most coverage has treated as a footnote, but it is not a footnote. It is actually one of the most revealing things about how America processes cases like this one in the social media era, and it is worth examining carefully because it shaped the atmosphere around this trial in ways that may have consequences for the appeal as well. In the days and weeks after Austin Metcalf died and Karmelo Anthony was arrested, something happened online that is now very familiar, but no less disturbing for its familiarity. The case became a vessel, a container into which people poured their pre-existing beliefs about race and crime and justice and self-defense and who deserves sympathy in America. The actual facts of what happened on April 2, 2025 became almost secondary to the symbolic weight both sides of the argument loaded onto those facts. Fundraising pages launched almost immediately. Karmelo Anthony's family set up a campaign on GiveSendGo to cover legal defense costs and other expenses. By early May of 2025, less than a month after the stabbing, that campaign had raised more than $515,000. $515,000 for a 19-year-old from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, whose family had moved to Texas. That amount of money reflects not just sympathy for Anthony's circumstances, but a specific political and cultural investment in what his case represented to the people donating. On the other side, GoFundMe campaigns were launched on behalf of Austin Metcalf's family, by his father and by the owner of the pizzeria in Frisco where Metcalf worked. Those campaigns raised nearly $250,000. The founder of GiveSendGo, the platform hosting Anthony's fundraiser, publicly compared the case to those of Kyle Rittenhouse and Daniel Penny, two cases that had become touchstones in national arguments about self-defense law and race. The implication was clear. GiveSendGo saw the Anthony case through the same ideological lens that had driven fundraising for those other defendants. Anthony's campaign became a cause for people who believed a young black man had been unjustly arrested for defending himself. And then the disinformation started. Within days of Metcalf's death, an account on the social platform X began impersonating the Frisco Police Department chief. That account published a fabricated autopsy report. The post reached millions of views across multiple platforms before the Frisco Police Department was able to issue public corrections. The FBI began an investigation into the impersonation. But by then, the fake report had already circulated widely enough to contaminate public understanding of the case. There were also false claims that the Anthony family had used donated funds to purchase a new car and a $900,000 house. Those claims spread rapidly. The fact-checking organization Snopes investigated and determined the family had not withdrawn any money from the donations at the time the claims were made. The allegations appeared to trace back to a story from the Daily Mail. But once that kind of accusation enters the social media bloodstream, it does not leave, regardless of how thoroughly it is debunked. What all of this means for the trial, and now for the appeal, is significant in a way that is not always acknowledged. By the time the trial began in June of 2026, more than 14 months had passed since the stabbing. During those 14 months, this case had generated an enormous amount of noise, false information, weaponized fundraising, protest groups, death threats, swatting incidents, doxing, FBI investigations into harassment. Judge Angela Tucker, who made the initial bond reduction decision, received enough threats that law enforcement launched an investigation. The courts approved moving the Anthony family to an undisclosed location due to documented safety concerns. All of that noise and heat and distortion. And somehow a jury of 12 people was supposed to walk into a courtroom in Collin County and evaluate the evidence with clear eyes. The defense's Batson argument does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of a case that was already from its earliest days deeply racialized, not by the lawyers in the courtroom, but by the country watching from outside. When the prosecution used 3 peremptory strikes to remove the final 3 black jurors from that pool, they may have done so for entirely legitimate professional reasons. Or they may have done so in a racially charged environment where they calculated, consciously or not, that black jurors would be less sympathetic to a prosecution narrative in a case that had become a symbol in a larger cultural war. That is exactly the kind of inquiry the appellate court is equipped to conduct. And it is exactly the kind of inquiry that takes the full voir dire transcript, the full questionnaire record, and a detailed comparison of how jurors of different racial backgrounds were questioned and evaluated. There is also something worth noting about the jury composition argument that goes beyond just the legal question of Batson. Collin County, Texas, is the county where this trial was held. It is a predominantly white, Republican-leaning suburban county that voted consistently in certain political directions in recent election cycles. Some legal observers had noted before the trial even began that the question of venue, of whether an impartial jury could genuinely be seated in Collin County for a case with this level of racial and cultural weight, was worth examining. The defense did not pursue a change of venue, as far as the public record indicates. But the demographics of the jury pool, and the striking of the black jurors who did appear in it, will now form the core of the appellate argument. What about the self-defense claim itself? Because it is worth going back to that argument with fresh eyes, now that the trial is over. Texas has a self-defense statute that allows the use of force, including deadly force, if a person reasonably believes that force is immediately necessary to protect themselves against another person's use of unlawful force. The key word there is reasonably. The question for the jury was not whether Karmelo Anthony was frightened. Fear alone does not establish self-defense under Texas law. The question was whether a reasonable person in his exact situation, seated in a tent, confronted by multiple people, being told to leave, with a physical altercation either in progress or immediately imminent, would have believed that deadly force was immediately necessary. The prosecution's argument was that Anthony had options he did not take. He could have stood up and left. He could have called for help. He could have de-escalated. Instead, he warned that he had something in his backpack while keeping his hands inside it, waited for physical contact, and then used a concealed knife to stab Austin Metcalf once in the chest. The prosecution argued he created the conditions for the confrontation and then exploited them. The defense's argument was about the reality of what a 17-year-old experiences in a moment of perceived threat. Anthony was seated. He was outnumbered. The person he was arguing with was significantly larger than him. Multiple people were involved in the confrontation. He did not know what was going to happen next. The defense argued that in that split second when Austin Metcalf made physical contact, Anthony responded from a place of genuine fear. The jury rejected that argument in under 3 hours. They did not convict on manslaughter, which would have required only a finding of recklessness or negligence. They convicted on murder, which requires intent. Their verdict says they believed Karmelo Anthony intended to cause Austin Metcalf's death, or at minimum intended to cause serious bodily harm through the use of a deadly weapon. That is the finding now sitting before the 5th District Court of Appeals, not just whether the jury got it right on the facts. Appellate courts do not typically second-guess factual findings, but whether the process that led to that jury's verdict was constitutionally sound from start to finish. One more thing before we close this chapter. Something that I think is genuinely important and that tends to get lost in the noise around high-profile cases like this one. Legal appeals in murder cases are not evidence that someone is innocent. They are not evidence of guilt either. They are a mechanism built into the American legal system specifically because the framers of that system understood that trials are conducted by human beings, that human beings make errors, that judges make errors, and that some of those errors are serious enough to undermine the integrity of the process itself. When Michael Howard filed that notice of appeal on June 10, 2026, he was not saying the jury was corrupt. He was not necessarily saying the prosecution acted in bad faith. He was saying that there are legal questions arising from this trial that deserve examination by a higher court. That is exactly what the appeals process exists for. Whether those questions are resolved in Karmelo Anthony's favor or not, the fact that they are being examined at all matters. Because the Batson principle, the constitutional prohibition against removing jurors because of their race, is not just a rule that protects black defendants in racially charged cases. It is a rule that protects the integrity of the jury system itself. Every person who sits in a courtroom, regardless of the color of their skin, is entitled to be judged by a process free from racial manipulation. That principle is worth defending whether you believe Karmelo Anthony is guilty of murder, innocent, or somewhere in the complicated middle. The case of Karmelo Anthony is about a lot of things simultaneously. It is about two 17-year-olds and a rainy morning in April. It is about self-defense law in Texas and the line between fear and intent. It is about racial dynamics in a fast-growing suburban county and a jury box that had no black representation in a racially charged trial. It is about what social media does to cases before they ever reach a courtroom. And it is about a legal system being asked to answer questions that go well beyond any individual verdict. Those questions are now in the hands of judges in downtown Dallas. And however long it takes, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, True Crime Vault will be here covering every development. Because these cases do not end with a verdict. They end when the last question has been asked and answered. And we are nowhere near there yet. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter, and you matter for having them. True Crime Vault. We unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered.